It's funny how our brains naturally sort of categorize the world around us. Like usually when we think about healthcare or, when we talk about healthcare infrastructure, our minds immediately jump to the really big, visible, tangible things.
Right, like the physical spaces mostly,
Yeah.
the buildings themselves.
Exactly. We picture those towering hospitals taking up entire city blocks. We picture the shiny multi-million-dollar MRI machines or, the ambulances with their sirens blaring, just weaving through traffic.
Yeah, it's a very physical, very obvious architecture.
It really is. You can literally walk up and touch it. And I think because we can see it, we tend to think that this physical architecture is just, well, the entirety of the healthcare system.
Right, because it's the destination, so it takes up all the mental real estate. We focus entirely on what happens once the patient is actually inside the room with the doctor.
Yeah, exactly. But then if you take a step back and start looking at the system holistically, you have to ask a very basic, almost childish question, which is, how do people actually get to those towering hospitals?
Right, the logistics of it.
Yeah, and suddenly when you start pulling on that thread, you realize you're not looking at physical architecture anymore. You are looking at a completely different kind of infrastructure. You're looking at this massive, sprawling, entirely invisible web of logistics.
And it's a web that is literally holding up the entire physical structure. I mean, if you cannot access the building might as well not exist for you.
Wow, that's the perfect way to frame it. Imagine a city decides to build a state-of-the-art, billion-dollar bridge to a revolutionary new hospital.
Yeah.
Best doctors, best equipment. It's a total miracle of modern medicine. But then, at the very beginning of this beautiful bridge, the state installs a toll booth.
Mm-hmm.
And this toll booth is strange. It doesn't take money.
Mm.
It only accepts a very specific type of paperwork, which has to be filed, days in advance.
Right.
Sometimes the gate just refuses to open no matter what you do. Sometimes the person working the booth is on a lunch break that lasts 3 hours.
Yeah.
And all the while, there is a line of incredibly vulnerable, sick people waiting in the cold, just hoping to get across the bridge to get the care they supposedly have a right to access.
That is a remarkably accurate and I would say sobering picture of the medical transportation landscape in this country, and specifically what we're looking at today. That toll booth is really the ultimate bottleneck in modern healthcare.
And that bottleneck is exactly what we are focusing on for this deep dive. So welcome, everyone. Today, we are going to completely demystify a critical yet largely hidden middleman system that operates right under our noses in New York State.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one.
We are looking at something called MAS, or Medical Answering Services. And our sources for this deep dive include a really comprehensive guide that details how Medicaid non-emergency medical transportation actually works in New York.
And crucially, we're also pulling from some really illuminating insights provided by private pay alternatives in the space.
Right. Specifically looking at a company called SwiftAid Transport.
Yeah, and bringing in that private pay perspective is what makes this analysis so rich, I think, because it gives us a dual lens.
Exactly. On one hand, we get to see the rigid state-mandated infrastructure, like how the government thinks transportation should work. And on the other hand, we get to see the private market workarounds that have sprouted up precisely because the state system is just full of friction. So our mission today is to completely unpack this hidden ecosystem. We want to know what exactly is MAS. We're going to walk through the meticulous, sometimes maddening process of actually trying to use it.
It's definitely a process.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
We're going to explore why it can be so incredibly frustrating for the people who rely on it for their very survival. And perhaps most importantly, we're going to look at how patients are forced to effectively navigate the massive, dangerous gaps between this public health infrastructure and the messy realities of their daily lives.
Because it is one of those classic administrative systems, right? It looks perfectly logical, perfectly clean when you're looking at it on a spreadsheet in a government office.
Yeah.
But it operates very differently when it actually hits the pavement in the real world.
So whether you are currently managing care for an aging parent, or maybe you work in healthcare yourself and you deal with these delays all the time, or honestly, even if you're just fascinated by the hidden logistics of how vulnerable populations access basic human needs in a modern city, this deep dive is going to completely change how you view a simple 10-minute drive to the doctor.
It really forces you to redefine what the word access actually means in the context of healthcare.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to start at the absolute ground floor because if we don't understand the basic mechanics, nothing else is going to make sense. What exactly is MAS? Because I know that if you have ever tried to schedule a Medicaid-covered ride to a medical appointment anywhere in New York, you have probably heard this acronym thrown around. It stands for Medical Answering Services. But that name is almost aggressively boring and vague.
It really is. I mean, it sounds like a secretarial pool from the 1980s taking messages on pink slips of paper.
Right.
But the reality is far more complex and far more powerful. The most crucial thing to understand right off the bat before we get into anything else is what MAS is not.
Okay, I'm listening.
MAS does not own a single fleet of vehicles.
Wait, what?
Yeah, they do not own vans, they do not own sedans, they do not own ambulances, they do not employ the drivers who pick you up, they don't buy the gas, they don't pay for the car insurance.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Because I always assumed that if the state is providing the ride, they are running the cars. You know, like the Postal Service running mail trucks.
It's a very, very common misconception, but no. MAS is strictly a transportation management company. They are what the industry calls a broker.
A broker.
Yeah, they are the designated entity that coordinates Medicaid transportation across the entirety of New York State.
So they're essentially a massive middleman.
They are the ultimate middleman. They sit directly between the millions of Medicaid patients who need a ride on one side and the hundreds of independent transportation providers who actually own the cars and vans on the other side.
Let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this. If they don't own the cars and they aren't driving the cars, what are they actually doing to justify their existence? Like, what is the day-to-day operation of a giant middleman?
Well, they're the central nervous system for the entire operation. They are responsible for taking the inbound requests for rides from Medicaid patients. They are responsible for assigning those specific trips to the approved transportation providers in the patient's area.
Oh, I see.
And crucially, they verify that the patient is actually eligible for the ride. And they manage all the trip authorizations so that the transportation company eventually gets paid by Medicaid.
So it is entirely administrative. It's just pure bureaucracy.
It is entirely bureaucratic, yes. But to understand why this massive bureaucracy exists and why it's actually deemed necessary by the state, we have to take a step back and look at the historical context.
Right.
We have to look at what things were like before MAS existed. We have to look at the before times.
I'm glad you brought that up because my initial reaction to hearing about a giant middleman that just handles paperwork is, well, that sounds incredibly inefficient. Why not just let the patients call the cab companies directly?
Which is exactly what people wonder.
Right. Because New York State didn't just wake up one day and decide to invent a bureaucratic middleman just for the fun of it. There had to be a catalyst.
The catalyst was a staggering amount of money being lost to fraud and inefficiency.
Ah.
Yeah. Before systems like MAS were put in place, the world of Medicaid transportation was incredibly decentralized. It was, for lack of a better term, the absolute Wild West of non-emergency medical transport.
How so? Like, paint a picture of the Wild West for me.
Well, imagine a system where every single clinic, every single patient, and every single local mom-and-pop cab company are coordinating rides completely independently.
Okay.
A patient calls a local cab, says, I need to go to the doctor. The cab takes them. And then the cab company just sends a bill directly to the state Medicaid office.
On the surface, I mean, that sounds great for the patient. Very simple.
For the patient, it was very simple. But when you have a system with billions of dollars flowing through it and absolutely zero centralized oversight, human nature takes over.
Right. Of course.
The potential for fraud wasn't just astronomical. The fraud was actively happening on a massive scale.
How does that fraud actually work in practice? I mean, a ride to the doctor is a pretty straightforward transaction.
Yeah.
How are people scamming it?
There are a million ways to scam a decentralized system. Providers could bill the state for trips that simply never happened. They call them ghost rides.
Ghost rides.
Yeah. A cab company gets a list of Medicaid ID numbers, and suddenly they're billing the state for 50 rides a day that no one actually took.
Just generating fake invoices.
Exactly. Or you had situations where patients might use a Medicaid-funded cab for non-medical reasons.
Like what?
Well, they call the cab, say they are going to the pharmacy, but they actually have the driver drop them off at the grocery store or a friend's house.
Oh, no.
And the state pays the fare, no questions asked, because there is no one checking. There was overbilling, there were unverified trips, and there was a complete and total lack of accountability.
So the state is just bleeding money. They are looking at this hemorrhaging budget, looking at millions of dollars disappearing into the ether of unverified cab rides, And they realized they need a gatekeeper.
Precisely. The state realized they could not continue to write blank checks to thousands of independent transportation companies, so they created the broker model.
Enter MAS.
Exactly. MAS was brought in to be that gatekeeper. Their entire mandate, the reason they exist, is to prevent fraud in Medicaid transportation, to ensure that every single ride the state pays for is actually medically necessary, and to standardize the scheduling process across the entire state so they can track the data.
Okay, so they brought order to the Wild West.
They introduced strict structure and oversight to a system that was previously chaotic.
I am picturing MAS as, like, the ultimate bouncer at an exclusive club.
I like that analogy.
Right, because they're not the DJ providing the music. They are not the bartender pouring the drinks. In this analogy, the music and the drinks are the actual medical care and the ride itself.
Yeah.
The bouncer doesn't provide any of the actual service you came for. They are just a very imposing figure standing at the door, holding a clipboard, making sure you're on the list, making sure you're wearing the right shoes, and making sure you belong there before they unhook the velvet rope.
I think that is a very apt analogy. Their job is to scrutinize you. Their job is to be suspicious of you, in a way, to ensure the state's resources are protected.
But this brings up a really critical question, and it's something I want us to keep in mind for the rest of this conversation.
Okay.
By adding this incredibly strict bouncer to prevent fraud, did the state actually make the experience better for the patient? Or did they just make it better for the state's budget? Because preventing fraud is a noble goal. But if the patient can't get to the doctor, the system is failing its primary mission.
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's the inherent tension of the entire system. The centralization absolutely solved a problem for the state.
Right, it stopped the bleeding.
It brought the hammer down on the overbilling. It brought order and data to the chaos. But a system that is entirely optimized for fraud prevention and cost control is rarely a system that is optimized for user experience.
Right, because the bouncer doesn't care if you're cold while you wait in line.
Nope.
The bouncer doesn't care if your feet hurt. The bouncer only cares that his clipboard is accurate and that no one sneaks in.
Exactly. The oversight that protects the taxpayer dollar almost always manifests as a massive administrative burden on the patient. It creates friction.
So the state traded financial chaos for logistical friction.
That's a great way to put it.
So to figure out if this middleman actually serves the patient, we need to move past the state's perspective and look at it from the ground level. We need to look at exactly who is trying to get past that bouncer and the precise hoops they have to jump through to get a simple ride.
Right. We have to look at the users.
Exactly. Who is the typical user of MAS? Because we aren't talking about 20-somethings heading to the gym.
No, the demographic profile of a typical MAS user is quite specific, and it is crucial to understand who we are talking about. We're talking about Medicaid recipients who simply do not have access to personal transportation.
And just by virtue of being on Medicaid, we are already talking about a low-income population.
Yes. The primary users are seniors who can no longer safely drive. It is individuals with physical or cognitive disabilities.
Okay.
It's low-income patients who cannot afford a car, gas, or insurance. And very notably, it is people who are undergoing intensive, ongoing medical treatments.
Like what kind of treatments?
Things like daily dialysis, chemotherapy, or radiation. People who might be so physically exhausted by the treatment that they are simply too weak to drive themselves or navigate the stairs and transfers of public transit.
Wow. So these are arguably the most vulnerable populations in the entire state.
Absolutely.
These are people for whom missing a medical appointment doesn't just mean a minor inconvenience. It's not like me missing a teeth cleaning and rescheduling for next month.
No, not at all.
For this population, missing a ride can mean a severe degradation in their health, an emergency room visit, or even hospitalization.
The stakes are incredibly high. For a dialysis patient, missing a treatment because the ride didn't show up is a life-threatening event.
Let's walk through the exact literal reality of how one of these patients actually navigates this system. What does it look like to get a ride? We know it's not as simple as calling a cab. How does the patient interact with this massive bureaucracy?
Well, it is a very rigid process. The system is designed as a series of gates you have to pass through.
Let's look at the first gate, the absolute foundation. I assume the patient has to actually be enrolled in Medicaid.
Yes, you must have active Medicaid coverage.
Sounds obvious.
It sounds obvious, but in the real world, it is a significant hurdle. Medicaid paperwork is notoriously complex. People have to recertify their eligibility regularly.
Miss it.
If your paperwork lapses, even for a week because you missed a piece of mail, your Medicaid status becomes inactive. And if your status is inactive, MAS will absolutely not authorize a ride. You are just locked out of the system.
Okay, so let's say my paperwork is flawless. My Medicaid is active. I have an appointment with my cardiologist next Thursday. What is my next move?
The next phase is initiating the request. The patient, or very often their healthcare provider or a social worker at a clinic, contacts MAS to request the transportation.
And what information do they have to give?
They provide the appointment date, the time, the location of the doctor, and the patient's pickup address.
And this is where the bouncer pulls out the clipboard. I've given them my destination. They don't just say, great, a car will be there.
No. This leads immediately into the most critical part of the bureaucratic process, which is the review of eligibility and necessity.
Okay.
MAS does not just take your word for it. They are checking two very specific things. First, they verify again that you qualify for transportation under the Medicaid guidelines.
Right.
But second, and this is where a huge amount of friction occurs, they have to determine if the trip is medically necessary.
I want to stick on this point for a second because that concept, proving medical necessity for every single ride, feels like a massive shift from the Wild West days we talked about earlier.
Oh, it is the defining feature of the broker model. You can't just call MAS and say, I'm feeling under the weather, I want to go to the local walk-in clinic.
Why not? If I'm sick, isn't going to the clinic medically necessary?
From a human perspective, yes. But from a bureaucratic perspective, you have to justify the destination according to strict guidelines.
Right.
You have to prove that the service you are receiving at that destination is a Medicaid-covered service. If you are going to a provider that doesn't accept Medicaid, MAS won't take you.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. You also have to prove that the specific medical service is necessary and that you have absolutely no other physical or financial way to get there. It is a clinical triage of your mobility.
A clinical triage of your mobility.
Yeah.
That is a fascinating phrase. So I am basically on trial, proving that I am incapable of getting myself to this doctor.
Yes. And speaking of mobility, before MAS approves the ride, they also have to categorize your physical body.
What do you mean?
They don't just send the same vehicle to everyone. The state system categorizes transportation into 3 distinct levels, based entirely on the patient's physical needs.
Let's break those down because this really highlights how clinical the logistics get. The first level is ambulatory transportation.
Think of this as the baseline. This is for patients who can walk on their own, or who perhaps just need minimal assistance, like a steadying hand or the use of a cane.
Okay.
They don't require specialized equipment to get into a vehicle. For an ambulatory patient, MAS is going to assign a standard sedan or a regular taxi. It is the lowest tier of intervention and the lowest cost to the state.
Okay, that makes sense. Then the second level is wheelchair transportation, which is often referred to in the industry as an ambulette.
Right. If a patient uses a wheelchair and cannot transfer out of it into a standard car seat, they require an ambulette.
And what exactly is that?
These are specialized vans equipped with hydraulic lifts or ramps, and they have tie-downs inside to secure the wheelchair during transit.
And the third level, which sounds the most intensive, is stretcher transportation.
Yes, this is for patients who must remain completely flat, lying down during transport due to their medical condition. But, and this is a key distinction, it is not an emergency situation.
Right, because if it's an emergency...
If it's an emergency, you call 911 and get an ambulance. Stretcher transport is for things like moving a bedbound patient from a nursing facility to a hospital for a scheduled procedure.
So MAS has to figure out which of these 3 buckets you fall into. But I imagine I can't just call up and say, hey, send me an ambulette, I'm feeling tired today.
Absolutely not. And this is where the paperwork burden explodes.
I can imagine.
This clinical categorization is vital for the state to manage costs because an ambulette costs significantly more than a taxi.
Right.
Because of that cost difference, the patient cannot self-diagnose their transportation need. The patient's medical provider, their actual doctor, often has to fill out specific, detailed forms justifying exactly why an ambulette is medically required instead of a standard taxi.
So the doctor, who is already swamped with medical charting, has to stop and fill out a form detailing the patient's lack of mobility just so the patient can get a ride.
Yes. It is more paperwork, more administrative friction, all designed to prove necessity to the bouncer at the door.
Okay, so let's say we have run the gauntlet. My Medicaid is active, my doctor filled out the form, proving I need a wheelchair van to get to my cardiology appointment. MAS looks at all of this, they stamp it approved.
Right.
Now we get to the actual signing of the ride. And this is the part of the process that completely blew my mind when I was researching this. Once the ride is approved, MAS assigns the trip to one of the approved transportation providers in their network. But the crucial reality here is that the patient has absolutely no choice in the matter.
None. They have essentially zero autonomy in this step.
Zero.
MAS's algorithm looks at the requested time, looks at the providers in the area, looks at the cost, and assigns the trip. The patient is simply notified of who will be picking them up.
I want to spend some time on this because that lack of choice is so deeply counterintuitive to how we operate in the modern world.
Oh, totally.
Like, imagine for a second opening a modern rideshare app on your phone, Uber or Lyft.
Okay.
But instead of just typing in the name of a restaurant and hitting request, you first have to legally prove to a government entity that going to this restaurant is a critical, life-saving event.
Which is wild to think about.
Right. You have to get a doctor's note saying you need to eat there. And then, once the government finally agrees that, yes, you can go to the restaurant, you have absolutely zero say in who picks you up.
It's a jarring comparison, but it's entirely
You
accurate.
can't see the driver's name in advance. You can't see their rating. You can't say, hey, I had a really great driver last week named Sarah. She was so careful with my walker. Can I request Sarah?
Nope.
You can't request a specific local company that you know has clean vans. You just get whatever the algorithm spits out.
It is a total surrender of control. And we have to view this through the lens of the patient demographic we established earlier.
Right, the most vulnerable.
We are talking about the elderly. We are talking about people with severe disabilities. We are talking about people who are chronically ill. This is a demographic that is already, on a daily basis, grappling with the profound loss of their independence.
Oh, that's such a good point.
Their bodies are failing them, or society isn't built for their mobility needs. So to then have their basic logistical autonomy entirely stripped away by a state bureaucracy, it can be psychologically profound.
It feels incredibly infantilizing.
It absolutely can feel that way. You are no longer a consumer choosing a service in a marketplace. You are a package being routed by a logistics algorithm. You are freight.
That is a brutal way to put it, but it seems true. You are a piece of medical freight being moved from point A to point B.
Yeah.
And the system expects you to just be grateful that the truck arrived at all.
And that brings us to the final reality of the process, the actual transportation. The assigned company picks up the patient, takes them to the doctor, and takes them home, assuming, of course, that everything goes perfectly according to the spreadsheet.
Which, knowing what we know about New York traffic, bureaucracy, and just the chaos of the physical world, is an incredibly generous assumption.
It is the assumption where the entire system begins to fracture.
Let's transition into that fracture. Because looking at MAS purely as a flowchart, it makes sense. The state prevents fraud, the patient gets a free ride, check, check.
Yeah, on paper, it's great.
But when you step off the flowchart and look at it from the curb, when you are the patient actually standing outside waiting for the car, the friction points are massive. This system is notorious for its chronic issues.
And we aren't just speculating here. Patient advocacy groups, social workers, and even the state's own audits have been remarkably candid about these challenges.
Oh, they know it's flawed.
They don't shy away from the fact that while MAS is an absolutely vital safety net, it is a safety net full of very large, very dangerous holes.
Let's examine the daily reality of these holes. What is it actually like to rely on this system? The first major issue is one we just touched on, the complete lack of control and the inability to build trust.
Right. The fact that you cannot request a preferred provider or a specific driver.
And I want to push on why this matters so much. A skeptical person might say, who cares? It's a free ride. Stop complaining that you can't pick the driver. You don't get to pick the bus driver on public transit. Why is the lack of choice such a critical failure in medical transport specifically?
Because medical transport is an inherently intimate service. We aren't talking about a healthy person hopping into the back of a taxi and looking at their phone for 10 minutes.
Right.
We are talking about an elderly woman who might need physical assistance getting from her front door, down a flight of porch steps, and into the vehicle. We are talking about someone who might be confused or anxious. We're talking about an ambulance driver who has to physically secure a patient's wheelchair.
So it requires physical touch and trust.
Exactly. Trust is a massive component of healthcare. If you have a different stranger showing up at your door every single time you have an appointment, and let's be honest, In a massive system driven by the lowest bidder, some of those drivers might be impatient, they might be rushed, they might be rough when assisting you. It is incredibly stressful for the patient.
It creates anxiety before the appointment even begins.
Yes. And conversely, when a patient does find a driver who treats them with dignity, someone who is patient, who knows how to navigate their specific driveway, it is entirely natural to want to request them again.
If it's safe.
It provides peace of mind. But the MAS algorithm is blind to human rapport. It doesn't care that driver A makes the patient feel safe. It only cares about geographical efficiency and lowest cost.
Which brings us to the second and arguably most devastating daily frustration. The waiting.
Oh, the waiting.
The sheer amount of time patients are forced to surrender to the system. The system is infamous for delayed pickups and agonizingly long wait times, particularly for the return trips after the medical appointment is over.
This phenomenon raises a really important philosophical question about the hidden costs of free healthcare. Yes, the ride does not cost the patient any money out of their pocket, but it costs them an enormous, sometimes unreasonable amount of their time.
And time is a resource that sick people often do not have an abundance of.
Exactly.
Let's play that out in the real world. Say I am a healthy person and I have a routine doctor's appointment at 2:00 p.m. The doctor's office is 20 minutes away. I drive myself. The appointment takes an hour. I am back in my car and home by 3:30 p.m.
A very standard errand.
Right. The whole endeavor took an hour and a half of my day. What does that exact same 2:00 p.m. appointment look like for an MAS user?
It is an entirely different reality. Because MAS transportation providers are constantly juggling massive manifests of patients across a wide area, they often operate on huge pickup windows.
Pickup windows. Okay.
So for a 2:00 p.m. appointment, MAS might tell you that your pickup window is anywhere between 12:00 p.m. and 1:30 p.m.
So I have to be ready, coat on, sitting by the door for an hour and a half, just waiting for the outbound trip.
Yes. And let's say they pick you up at 12:30. You arrive at the doctor incredibly early. You wait. You have your 1-hour appointment. You finish at 3:00 p.m. Now you need your ride home.
So I just walk out and the car is there.
No, you cannot just walk out to a waiting car. The clinic has to call MAS to say you are ready, or you call them yourself.
Wow.
MAS then has to dispatch a vehicle that is likely busy dropping someone else off.
Oh, no.
It is very common for patients to wait 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours in a clinic waiting room for their return ride.
So my 1.5-hour errand has now consumed my entire day. I am finally getting home at 6 p.m.
And remember the demographic. Imagine you're doing that not for a routine checkup, but after a grueling 3-hour dialysis treatment.
Oh, that's rough.
Your blood has literally been filtered outside of your body. You are exhausted. You are nauseous. Your blood pressure might be fluctuating. All you want is your own bed.
Yeah.
And instead, you are sitting in a hard plastic chair in a fluorescent-lit waiting room for 3 hours, waiting for a van that was dispatched from 2 towns over. It is a profound lack of dignity.
That is harrowing. And I imagine that massive logistical bottleneck, the fact that the system moves so slowly, is exactly why the scheduling rules are so strict, which is the third major friction point. You cannot just use MAS on a whim.
No. Because the bureaucracy is so dense and the providers are so overbooked, MAS requires strict advance notice. You generally need to book these rides days, if not a full week or more, in advance.
A full week.
They have to pre-approve the eligibility, authorize the trip, and slot you into a provider's schedule.
Okay, I understand the logistical necessity of that from the state's perspective.
Yeah.
They need time to plan the routes. But let's look at it from the patient's perspective. Human health does not operate on a 2-week advance notice schedule.
Not at all.
What happens if I wake up on a Tuesday morning with a strange, sharp pain in my side? It's not a 911 emergency. I don't need an ambulance to the ER, but I definitely need to see my specialist.
Okay.
I call my specialist, and by a miracle, the receptionist says, we actually had a cancellation. The doctor can squeeze you in today at 2:00 p.m. Can I use MAS to get to that appointment?
Under the strict MAS framework, securing that last-minute urgent but non-emergency ride is virtually impossible. The bureaucracy simply cannot move fast enough.
Wow.
They cannot intake your request, verify your eligibility, prove the medical necessity of this sudden visit, find an available transportation provider, and dispatch a vehicle on the same day. The gears of the machine do not turn that quickly.
So what happens to the patient?
The patient has to decline the appointment. They miss the opportunity to be seen by the doctor when the issue is acute. They likely have to wait weeks for the next available slot.
So their actual physical health suffers because the logistics system cannot adapt. The tail is completely wagging the dog.
It really is.
The transportation was supposed to facilitate the healthcare, but instead the limitations of the transportation are dictating the healthcare.
Precisely. And the system's attempts to maximize its own efficiency often make the patient experience even worse. Which brings us to the fourth major frustration, and this is a massive one: shared rides.
Right. To reduce cost to the state, MAS actively groups passengers together. They call it multi-loading.
This is the ultimate, starkest example of the debate between efficiency and dignity. From the state's perspective, the math is undeniable.
How so?
If you have 3 different Medicaid patients all living in the same general zip code and they all have appointments at the same massive medical complex around the same time, it is incredibly financially inefficient to pay 3 separate cab companies to send 3 separate cars to do 3 separate trips.
The state looks at that and says, we are paying triple for the same route.
Exactly. So to save taxpayer money, the algorithm groups them. MAS assigns 1 ambulance or 1 van to pick up all 3 patients.
Okay, I want to play devil's advocate here because honestly, that sounds entirely reasonable. We all understand carpooling, it reduces emissions, it saves money. Why is multi-loading such a disaster in medical transport?
Because human lives, and particularly medical appointments, are not neat little data points on a spreadsheet. They are unpredictable. Let's look at the reality of that shared ride.
Okay, let's walk through it.
The van picks up patient A at 8:00 a.m. Then it drives 20 minutes in the wrong direction to pick up patient B at 8:20 a.m. Then it hits traffic, gonna pick up patient C.
Oh boy.
By the time patient A arrives at their doctor, they have been in the van for an hour and a half for a trip that should have taken 20 minutes.
Okay, annoying, but they got there.
But the real chaos happens on the return trip. The van returns to the medical complex to take all 3 patients home. Patient A's appointment was just a quick blood draw. It took 20 minutes. Patient B had a complex consultation that took 2 hours. Patient C's doctor had an emergency and is running an hour behind schedule.
Oh, I see where this is going.
So now patient A is sitting in the van in the parking lot for 3 hours, waiting for patient B and patient C to finish.
3 hours in a van.
Or the van leaves without patient A, does another route, and tells patient A to wait in the lobby until they circle back. It creates a domino effect of delays that ripples across the entire city's transportation network.
It's like an airline overbooking flights to save a few bucks. We all instinctively hate that because we know the airline is prioritizing its profit margin over our time.
Right.
But the stakes here are so much higher. If my flight is overbooked, I might miss a day of my vacation sitting in an airport bar. It's annoying. But imagine missing a specialist appointment that took you 6 months to book, simply because the van you were in had to make 3 other stops and hit construction traffic.
That is the core philosophical conflict of this entire system, the silos of bureaucracy. If a patient misses a critical chemotherapy appointment because their shared ride was an hour late, the negative health outcome for that patient, the potential tumor growth, the eventual need for emergency surgery, will cost the state hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Wow.
But the money the state saved by grouping those rides was only $40.
It's just so short-sighted.
But because the transportation budget is managed separately from the clinical outcomes budget, the algorithm only sees the $40 saved today. It doesn't see the massive medical cost incurred tomorrow.
And when things inevitably do go wrong, when the van is late, when the dominoes fall, the patient runs into the 5th and final frustration: the communication black hole.
Yes. Patients report severe systemic difficulty reaching support or getting any kind of accurate update when a driver is delayed.
Let's go back to that elderly patient we talked about earlier, the one standing on the curb in the winter.
Yeah.
If I call an Uber and it's delayed, I can look at my smartphone. I see a little car icon moving on a map.
You have visibility.
Right. I know exactly where the driver is. I know if they missed a turn, and the app tells me arriving in 4 minutes. I have information, which gives me a sense of control. What does the MAS patient have?
They have absolutely nothing. They have a pickup window that expired an hour ago and a phone number for a massive call center. They do not have an app. They do not have the direct cell phone number of the driver. They don't even know which local company is supposed to be picking them up until the vehicle arrives.
So they are standing in the cold, completely blind. They call MAS. What happens?
They are routed into a massive centralized queue. When they finally reach a dispatcher, that dispatcher doesn't know where the van is either.
Wait, really?
MAS, remember, is just the middleman. They don't track the individual vehicles via GPS in real time. So the MAS dispatcher has to put the patient on hold, try to contact the dispatch office of this specific local transportation company that was assigned the trip.
And that local dispatch office has to try to radio the specific driver.
Exactly. It is a massive game of telephone. Where are you? I'm dropping off a patient on 4th Street. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The local dispatcher tells MAS 20 minutes. MAS takes the patient off hold and tells them 20 minutes.
Yeah.
But by the time the message is relayed, the driver hit traffic and is now 40 minutes away. The information is outdated the moment it is spoken. And that patient is the one left freezing on the curb, feeling completely abandoned by the system that is supposed to be caring for them.
So what does this all mean? When you look at this gauntlet, the lack of choice, the agonizing waits, the inability to schedule urgent rides, the shared vans from hell, the communication black hole, if you are a patient trapped in this cycle, what do you do?
Right, you can't just give up.
You can't just throw your hands up in defeat and say, well, the van is late. I guess I just won't go to my cardiologist ever again.
No, you can't, because your life literally depends on getting to that appointment.
So how do people survive this? Because humans are resilient. When a system fails them, they find a way around it.
They adapt. They become incredibly strategic, almost militant about their logistics. They learn how to play the system. And more importantly, they learn when they have to abandon the system entirely.
And this brings us to the really fascinating reality of how people actually manage their healthcare logistics in the shadows of this massive public infrastructure. Because these administrative gaps can literally derail a person's health. Patients and their families are forced to find workarounds.
We see a lot of workarounds.
We are going to look at how they bridge these gaps by looking at private pay options, like SwiftAid transport, which we mentioned at the top of the show.
This is where we see the mechanics of the free market stepping in to fill the craters left by public infrastructure.
Let's do a direct comparison to understand the contrast. MAS, as we have exhaustively established, is covered by Medicaid. The defining feature is that there is zero out-of-pocket cost for the eligible patient. The state foots the bill.
Free to the patient.
But as a result, it is highly structured, deeply inflexible, slow, and strips the patient of all choice.
It is a massive, blunt instrument.
On the other side of the ledger, you have private pay transportation companies like SwiftAid. What is their value proposition? Why do they exist?
Well, they exist to offer exactly what MAS cannot. They offer a faster service. They offer guaranteed reliability. They offer personalized care. You can request specific vehicle types. You can build rapport with drivers.
They treat you like a customer.
Exactly. They place a massive emphasis on patient comfort, clear communication, and preserving the patient's dignity.
But there is a massive BUT hovering over all of those benefits.
Oh, absolutely.
The BUT is the cost.
Yeah.
It is private pay. It costs money out of your own pocket.
Right. And we have to reground ourselves in the demographic reality here. We are talking about a Medicaid population. To qualify for Medicaid in New York, you have to be low income. You are living on fixed incomes, Social Security, or disability checks.
Right.
So the idea of paying $50 or $80 or $100 out of pocket for a round-trip medical ride is not a casual expense. It is not an upgrade to first class. It is a massive financial sacrifice. It means cutting back on groceries or electricity that month.
Which is a profound realization. It means that when these low-income patients are choosing to use a private pay service like SwiftAid, they aren't doing it just because they want a slightly nicer car or a chatty driver.
No, not at all.
They are doing it out of sheer desperation. They're using private pay because relying on the free MAS option has become too dangerous for their physical health.
Exactly. They are buying certainty when certainty is a matter of life and death.
Let's look at the specific trigger points. When does a patient look at the free MES ride, look at their very limited bank account, and decide, I have to pay for this myself? There are very specific situations where patients consistently abandon the public system.
There are a few main ones. What is the first trigger point?
Time-sensitive appointments. We talked about this a bit earlier. Let's say you have a complex neurological issue. You've been waiting 6 months to see a top specialist. If you miss this appointment, the receptionist isn't going to squeeze you in tomorrow. You go straight back to the bottom of the 6-month waiting list.
The risk of MAS showing up 2 hours late or grouping you into a shared ride that gets lost is simply too high. You cannot gamble with a 6-month wait list.
So the patient or their children who are helping care for them swallow the cost. They pay the private company to guarantee that a dedicated car is sitting in their driveway at exactly 1:00 p.m., and they're sitting in that waiting room before their name is called.
They are buying the guarantee of access. What is the second scenario?
This one is huge, and it involves the broader healthcare system. Hospital discharges.
Oh, this is a massive friction point. When a hospital decides a patient is medically stable enough to go home, That hospital wants that bed empty immediately. Every hour, a discharged patient sits in a bed, the hospital's losing money and backing up the emergency room.
So the hospital discharge planner calls MAS to get the Medicaid patient a ride home.
And MAS, operating on its standard slow-moving timeline, might say, great, we can have a van there in 6 to 8 hours.
8 hours.
The hospital cannot wait 8 hours. More importantly, the patient, who has just spent a week sleeping in a noisy, uncomfortable hospital ward, is desperate to go home to their own bed. They don't want to sit in a discharge lounge all day.
Or of course not.
So rather than wait for the creaky gears of the state bureaucracy, families will just pull out their credit card and call a private transport company to get their loved one out of there immediately.
They are paying a ransom just to leave the hospital.
In a way, yes.
The third trigger point is what we can call rescue rides, making up for missed MAS rides. If MAS just entirely drops the ball, the van breaks down, the driver can't find the house, and they just never show up, the patient still needs to get to the doctor.
So they call SwiftAid or a local cab as an emergency backup.
And the fourth scenario is simply the psychological toll of needing consistent, reliable service. If you require dialysis 3 days a week, every single week of the year, I meant every single week of the year without fail.
Yeah, the sheer grinding anxiety of playing the MAS lottery 3 times a week can literally break a person down. Waking up on a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday and wondering, will the van come today? Will I have to wait 3 hours in the cold today? Will the driver be rude today?
That chronic stress has actual physiological effects on the body. It degrades your health. So families will pool their money to pay for private transport for those recurring, vital appointments just to remove that layer of toxic stress from the patient's life.
Exactly. What we are describing here, when you look at all these workarounds, is the emergence of a hybrid strategy.
And I find this fascinating and honestly deeply sobering from a sociological perspective. These vulnerable patients are essentially forced to ration their own resources to patch the holes in the state's safety net.
They are having to act as their own logistics dispatchers, their own risk assessment actuaries.
Precisely. They use the free but deeply flawed MAS system for the low-stakes trips. A routine checkup, a trip to the pharmacy for a refill, a physical therapy appointment where being 20 minutes late isn't the end of the world.
Right. They endure the friction when they can afford the risk.
But for the high-stakes moments, the surgeries, the rare specialist visits, the hospital discharges, they tap into their own limited, precious financial reserves to buy certainty. They buy dignity.
It's a calculation they have to make every single time they interact with the medical system.
It makes me think of how people manage their television subscriptions. It's like having a basic cable package that the landlord provides for free. But the picture is fuzzy, the audio is out of sync, and sometimes the channel just drops out completely for hours at a time.
Okay, I see where you're going.
It's fine if you're just watching reruns on a Tuesday afternoon, but Sunday night is the finale of your favorite show, the one episode you absolutely cannot miss. So instead of trusting the fuzzy free cable, you go online and buy an expensive pay-per-view pass of the exact same channel, just to guarantee that the signal doesn't cut out during the climax of the story.
That is a brilliant analogy, but of course, the climax of the story isn't a television show. It's a cardiology exam that determines if you need open heart surgery.
Exactly. And the mental load of managing this dual hybrid system is entirely placed on the shoulders of the patient or their exhausted family caregivers. They are the ones who have to calculate the risk of every single appointment and decide which system to use.
Yeah, the burden is all on them.
In fact, if you look at the guides and the advocacy literature out there, they actually provide lists of tips for using MAS successfully. And when you read these tips, it really underscores how much the system demands of the patient just to function.
What kind of advice are they giving the patients?
The first piece of advice is to schedule incredibly early. Give as much notice as possible. Don't wait until the week before. The second piece of advice is to obsessively confirm your ride. Call MAS, call the provider, double-check the pickup time the day before, double-check it the morning of.
Notice what is happening there. The burden of confirmation, the burden of ensuring the logistics work, is being shifted entirely onto the patient, not the multi-million-dollar service provider.
Right. It's not MAS's job to reassure you. It's your job to badger them until you feel secure. The third tip is to be ready exactly on time. Be waiting by the door.
Which can be hard for this demographic.
It's very hard. Because the drivers operate on such tight, overbooked schedules, if you are a slow-moving elderly person and you take 3 extra minutes to get your coat and walk to the porch, the driver might legally be allowed to just mark you as a no-show and drive away.
So the power dynamic is incredibly skewed. The patient must be willing to wait 3 hours in a clinic for the driver, but the driver will not wait 3 minutes for the patient.
Exactly. And then there's the final piece of advice in these survival guides, which I think is the most telling of all. The final tip is have a backup plan.
Wow.
The official, pragmatic advice for using this state-mandated billions of dollars vital healthcare service explicitly includes the instruction to consider alternatives if timing is critical.
Hmm.
I have to push back on the entire premise of the system here. If a system's own survival guide tells you to have a backup plan for when things are actually important, isn't that an explicit admission that the primary plan is fundamentally broken?
It is an absolute admission of systemic fragility. You don't tell people to have a backup parachute unless you know the main parachute fails a significant percentage of the time.
Yeah.
When a healthcare system tells its most vulnerable users not to trust it when the stakes are high, that system is operating as a safety net made entirely of holes. It is functioning as a deterrent, not a service.
It is incredible. We started this deep dive talking about the massive towering architecture of medicine, the hospitals, the doctors, the literal buildings. But what we've discovered over the last hour is that for a massive portion of the population, simply accessing that architecture requires navigating a logistical obstacle course that would exhaust a healthy, wealthy person, let alone someone who is sick, elderly, and living in poverty.
We have taken a seemingly simple, mundane concept, a 10-minute car ride to a local doctor, and revealed it as a complex, sprawling ecosystem of state bureaucracy, financial friction, and profound human resilience.
To summarize the journey we've been on today, we established that a system like MAS is, theoretically, a vital necessity in a state as large as New York. It wasn't created out of malice. It was created to solve a very real, very expensive problem of rampant fraud and to standardize a completely chaotic landscape.
Right. It serves as the ultimate bouncer, checking everyone's credentials to protect the public purse.
But we also saw, in granular detail, the severe logistical and emotional toll that this centralized control takes on the patients.
We saw the rigid rules for proving necessity, the total lack of patient autonomy, the disaster of multi-loaded shared rides, and the agonizing, undignified waits on the curb.
And we saw how these patients have been forced to become master logisticians, adopting a stressful hybrid model where they leverage out-of-pocket private pay alternatives like SwiftAid just to ensure they don't fall completely through the cracks of the public system when it matters most.
It is a profound, ground-level look at how massive public policy actually manifests in the daily lives of citizens, the spreadsheet versus the street.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought. We didn't explicitly read this in the source materials, but it builds directly on every single thing we just discussed. Think about the demographic trends of our country. Think about the fact that the baby boomer generation is aging. Our population is getting older rapidly.
We are approaching what demographers call the silver tsunami, a massive spike in the elderly population.
Exactly. So if transportation is already one of the most massive hidden barriers to healthcare right now, and if complex, creaking bureaucratic systems like MAS are essentially just giant band-aids barely covering up a fundamental lack of accessible public infrastructure, what happens in 10 years? What happens in 20 years?
What happens when the sheer volume of elderly patients requiring wheelchair vans and ambulettes doesn't just increase, but doubles or triples? The current system is already buckling under the weight.
Will it collapse entirely? And if it does, will this stressful hybrid model of relying on out-of-pocket private fallbacks become the mandatory standard for simply getting basic medical care?
Yeah.
Are we moving toward a future where if you cannot afford to buy your way past the broken public transportation system, you simply do not get to see a doctor at all? Will mobility become the ultimate divider between who gets to be healthy and who doesn't?
It forces us to ask a very uncomfortable question about our society. Is the physical ability to move a privilege of the wealthy, or is mobility a fundamental non-negotiable component of the human right to healthcare?
It is something to seriously mull over the next time you casually grab your keys, hop in your own car, put on your favorite music, and take a quick 10-minute stress-free drive to the pharmacy or the clinic. You are effortlessly bypassing a bureaucratic toll booth that millions of vulnerable people are currently stuck behind, waiting in the cold. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this thoroughly changed the way you see the hidden infrastructure operating all around you. Stay curious.